They wanted a reaction, not because they cared about your opinion, but because reactions are leverage. Noise is evidence you're still reachable. Anger is proof they can still touch you. Explanations are admissions you feel the pressure. And then something unexpected happened. You went quiet. No defense. No performance. No emotional labor. That silence wasn't set weakness. It was the final exam. And you passed. One reaction is the first loss. The moment you react, you hand the steering wheel to someone else. Not symbolically, literally. A reaction is information. It tells people where your nerves are exposed. It tells them what you value too much. It tells them exactly how to reach you next time. That sips the part most people refuse to accept. They think reacting is strength. They think defending themselves is dignity. They think explaining will set the record straight. It one step, because the moment you react, you've already agreed to play on their terms. People don't provoke out of curiosity. They provoke to measure access. Every sharp comment, silent treatment, disrespectful move, or subtle jab is a test. Not a misunderstanding, a test. They start asking one question: can I still move you? If you react emotionally, the answer is yes. And once someone knows they can move you, they don't stop. They refine. They get quieter, smarter, more precise. They don't need to hurt you loudly. They just need to touch the right nerve. That's why reactions are addictive to manipulators. Reactions are feedback. Feedback is control. Think about it honestly. Have you ever reacted and watched the other person calm down? No, they escalate. They push further. They press harder because your reaction told them something worked. Anger tells them they landed a hit. Defensiveness tells them you feel exposed. Over-explaining tells them you need validation. Silence followed by explanation tells them you felt the pressure. Every response feeds the machine. This is why the strongest people you've met weren't loud. They weren't set reactive. They weren't rushed to correct, justify, or defend. They didn't need to win the moment. They understood something deeper. The moment you react, you shrink the battlefield to the other person's terms. You step into their frame. You accept their premise. And now you're arguing inside a game you didn't design. When you stopped reacting, something subtle but important happened. The dynamic collapsed. No feedback loop. No emotional return. No signal to adjust tactics. That's what the game broke actually means. Without your reaction, there was nothing to calibrate against. They didn't know if they hurt you. They didn't know if you cared. They didn't know if you noticed. And uncertainty is unbearable for people who seek control. That's why silence feels loud to them. Your stillness didn't confuse them by accident. It confused them because they were expecting participation. Most people don't want peace. They want engagement on their terms. So when you gave nothing, they felt something they weren't prepared for: irrelevance. No data means no strategy. No reward means no motivation. No leverage means no power. That's why they often try one last push after you go quiet. A sharper comment. A guilt move. A sudden kindness. A manufactured crisis. They stir fishing. They're trying to confirm whether the silence is real or temporary. If you break at that point, the lesson resets. They learn patience works. But if you hold still, something irreversible happens. They stop seeing you as reactive. And people only try to control what they believe will respond. This is the part that feels counterintuitive. Doing nothing looks passive on the surface. But psychologically, it's a refusal to be positioned. You stir not avoiding the situation. You stir declining the role assigned to you. You stir saying without words, I don't accept this frame. I don't accept this timing. I don't accept this emotional demand. That's not weakness. That sits boundary without explanation. And explanation is where most people lose. Because explaining invites debate. Debate invites manipulation. Manipulation invites exhaustion. Stillness shuts the door before the trap is built. This doesn't mean you never speak. It means you choose when speech is useful instead of reflexive. Reaction is automatic. Response is deliberate. You didn't stop reacting because you were scared. You stopped because you realized reactions were costing you more than silence ever did. They were costing you clarity. They were costing you dignity. They were costing you energy. Every reaction drained you and fed them. So you stopped paying the price, and the moment you did, the balance shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once someone realizes they can't move you on impulse, they either respect you or remove themselves. Both outcomes are wins. That's why reaction is the first loss. And stillness is instead passive. It states refusal. 2. Stillness confuses manipulators. Manipulation survives on rhythm. Push. Reaction. Adjustment. Push again. That rhythm is everything. People who manipulate don't need power. They need predictability. They study timing. They learn how long it takes you to respond. They notice what tone makes you explain. They track what makes you defensive, guilty, eager, or emotional. Most of this happens without words, and most people never realize they're being studied. Manipulation isn't that loud. It's that's patterned. That's why stillness is so disruptive. When you stayed calm, the rhythm broke. When you didn't react, the script failed. When you didn't follow the expected move, the entire sequence collapsed. And this is where confusion begins. Manipulators rely on momentum. They escalate slowly. They test lightly before pressing harder. But all of that assumes one thing: response. Stillness removes the response, and without it, they're left guessing. Guessing is dangerous for someone who needs control. When you didn't reply the way they expected, they replayed the interaction in their head. When you didn't explain, they questioned their own leverage. When you didn't chase, they felt the imbalance shift. This is not theory. This is how human psychology reacts to uncertainty. People who manipulate need confirmation that their influence still works. They need to see the ripple. Your calm created a dead surface. Nothing echoed back. And silence doesn't just remove feedback. It forces projection. When there's no response, people fill the gap with themselves, their fears, their assumptions, their insecurity. That's why manipulators often unravel when you go still. They start talking more. They justify without being asked. They accuse without evidence. They suddenly explain their intentions. You didn't corner them. They exposed themselves. Stillness acts like a mirror with no frame. Whatever someone brings to it becomes visible. This is why calm people are often mislabeled as cold or detached, not because they lack emotion, but because others can read them, and what can be read can be controlled. Manipulators don't fear strength. They fear opacity. They don't need you weak. They need you legible. Your reactions made you legible. Your silence didn't. That's why confusion followed. Think about how many conflicts survive only because both sides keep responding. The argument exists because the exchange exists. When you stop participating, the conflict lost oxygen. No rhythm, no flow, no escalation. And escalation is the manipulator's tool. Without it, they don't know what to do next. That's why they often switch tactics when stillness appears. If provocation fails, they try guilt. If guilt fails, they try charm. If charm fails, they try urgency. If urgency fails, they try silence themselves. All of this is adaptation. Stillness forces them to cycle through strategies quickly because none of them land. And the faster someone switches strategies, the more obvious their intent becomes. You didn't need to accuse them. Their behavior did it for you. This is where most people panic. They feel the discomfort of not responding. They feel the itch to clarify, soften, or smooth things over. They mistake internal tension for danger, so they break stillness too early. That sips the mistake. Stillness feels uncomfortable because it removes your usual coping mechanisms. It takes away the relief of expression. It forces you to tolerate ambiguity. But that discomfort is temporary. The confusion on the other side grows with time. You were uncomfortable for minutes. They were destabilized for days, because stillness shifts the burden of emotional regulation away from you and onto them. You stir no longer managing their feelings. You stir no longer stabilizing the interaction. You stir no longer cushioning the tension. They have to sit with it. And most people who manipulate cannot sit with uncertainty. They need control to feel safe. When you didn't give them control, you didn't attack them. You removed their crutch. That's why stillness feels powerful without being aggressive. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't argue. It doesn't dominate. It simply doesn't comply. And non-compliance is devastating to someone who relies on influence. This is also why stillness is misinterpreted as arrogance. People assume silence means superiority because they can't read your intent. They don't know if you're angry, indifferent, strategic, or done, so they fill the gap with fear. You didn't create that fear. You just didn't manage it for them. Stillness teaches you something important. You learn who respects boundaries without explanation and who only behaves when managed. Those who are healthy adjust. Those who manipulate escalate. Either way, you gain clarity. That sits the hidden advantage. Stillness doesn't just confuse manipulators. It reveals them. And once someone is revealed, they lose their greatest weapon. Ambiguity. They can no longer pretend it was accidental. They can no longer hide behind misunderstanding. They can no longer claim innocence while repeating the same pattern. You see it clearly, and clarity ends the game. That's why stillness is dangerous to manipulators, not because it fights them, but because it leaves them alone with themselves. 3. Silence exposes intentions. Words are the easiest place to hide. People know how to perform sincerity. They know how to sound reasonable. They know how to dress motives in polite language. Silence removes the costume. When you stop talking, you stop giving people something to respond to. And when there's nothing to respond to, they reveal what they were actually trying to do. This is where most people misunderstand silence. They think silence is absence. It isn't. Silence is pressure. Conversation allows control. You speak, they redirect. You explain, they reframe. You clarify, they confuse. But silence doesn't move. And what doesn't move can be steered. When you stayed quiet, the interaction didn't end. It shifted. The other person kept going. They filled the space. They justified. They defended. They accused. They explained things you never asked about. That wasn't random. That was intent surfacing. People only over-explain when they feel exposed. They only accuse when they feel threatened. They only push when they expect resistance. Your silence gave them no resistance. So their real objective lost its disguise. This is how silence becomes a filter. When you speak less, you notice more. You hear tone instead of words. You see timing instead of excuses. You recognize patterns instead of stories. And patterns never lie. Words can be crafted. Intent leaks. Think about it carefully. If someone genuinely respects you, silence doesn't provoke them. They don't pressure you. They don't rush you. They don't demand access. They wait. Silence only irritates people who feel entitled to your response. That entitlement is the clue. When you stopped engaging, some people became impatient. Some became offended. Some became suddenly concerned. None of that was about you. It was about loss of access. Silence removes the ability to negotiate boundaries. And people who benefit from loose boundaries don't like that. That's why intentions surface. Without your participation, people are forced to act without cover. They can hide behind dialogue. They can manipulate through misunderstanding. They can soften pressure with charm. All that sits left is behavior. And behavior is the truth. This is why silence feels dangerous to people with hidden agendas. They lose the chance to reframe reality in real time. They lose the opportunity to guide the narrative. They lose control of perception, so they reveal themselves through impatience, escalation, or withdrawal. Each response tells you something. Pressure means entitlement. Guilt means manipulation. Anger means loss of control. Sudden kindness means strategy. You didn't need to analyze them. Their reaction to your silence did the analysis for you. This is also why silence feels uncomfortable at first. You're still used to explaining yourself. You're still used to smoothing things over. You're still used to managing other people's emotions. Silence takes that job away from you. And it shows you how much work you were doing that was never yours. When you stopped talking, you realized how many relationships depended on your effort alone. How many connections survived only because you carried the weight. How many dynamics collapsed the moment you stopped stabilizing them. That collapse wasn't a loss. It was exposure. Silence does destroy real relationships. It destroys performative ones. People with genuine intent don't panic when communication pauses. They don't rush to control the outcome. They don't demand reassurance. They trust the connection. Those who don't trust reveal themselves quickly. That's why silence is so clarifying. You learn who listens and who waits only for their turn to speak. You learn who respects autonomy and who confuses access with closeness. You learn who values you and who values influence over you. And once intentions are visible, decisions become simple. You stop guessing. You stop overthinking. You stop filling in blanks with hope. You see what is. Silence gives you that vision. Not because silence speaks, but because people do when they think you aren't set. That's why silence exposes intentions. And once intentions are exposed, nothing needs to be said. 4. Not everything deserves your energy. Most people waste energy not because they have too little, but because they spend it without judgment. They respond to everything. They explain to everyone. They engage with every provocation, every comment, every demand. And over time, they become exhausted without knowing why. Energy isn't drained by effort alone. It's drained by misdirected effort. You were taught that engagement is maturity, that silence is avoidance, that not responding means you're weak or afraid. That teaching is wrong. The truth is simpler and harsher. Some situations exist only to pull you out of alignment. Some people engage only to extract emotional labor. Some conversations are designed to go nowhere. Your reaction is the fuel. When you stopped reacting, you didn't lose your voice. You reclaimed your energy. This is where most people get stuck. They believe every accusation deserves a defense. Every misunderstanding deserves clarification. Every insult deserves a response. But that belief assumes the other side is acting in good faith. Often they are not. Some people already know the truth. They just want you to perform for it. They want to watch you justify yourself. They want to see you work for understanding. They want proof that you care more than they do. That exchange is unequal by design. Stillness breaks that inequality. By doing nothing, you sent a clear message without saying it. This does not qualify. Not everything qualifies for your time. Not everything qualifies for your emotion. Not everything qualifies for your explanation. Energy is not infinite. Attention is not free. Every time you engage with something meaningless, you teach your nervous system that chaos deserves priority. That training has consequences. You become reactive. You become anxious. You become fragmented. Stillness reverses that training. When you chose not to engage, you felt uncomfortable at first. Not because you were wrong, but because you were changing patterns. You were breaking the habit of self-abandonment. Most people don't realize how often they abandon themselves to maintain harmony. They ignore their instincts. They override their boundaries. They explain when they don't want to. Silence is the moment you stop doing that. This doesn't mean you avoid hard conversations. It means you stop having pointless ones. The set's a difference. Hard conversations have movement. They lead somewhere. They create clarity or resolution. Pointless ones recycle emotion and leave you drained. Stillness helps you tell them apart. When you stopped responding to everything, something interesting happened. Some people disappeared, some lost interest, some labeled you distant or changed. That reaction was the confirmation. They weren't connected to you, they were connected to your availability. Energy access felt like relationship to them. When you removed access, the relationship collapsed. That wasn't cruelty. That was truth. You also noticed something else. The fewer battles you fought, the clearer your mind became. The quieter your environment felt, the stronger your sense of self grew, because energy conserved becomes focus. Focus becomes authority. Authority doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It doesn't defend itself unnecessarily. It chooses. That's what you were doing when you did nothing. You weren't disengaging from life. You were disengaging from noise, and noise is expensive. It costs attention. It costs clarity. It costs peace. People who drain energy often frame themselves as urgent. They create pressure. They demand immediacy. Stillness reveals whether something is actually important or just loud. Important things wait. Manipulation rushes. That distinction matters. When you stopped giving energy to everything, you gained the ability to give it where it mattered. Your work improved. Your thoughts slowed. Your reactions softened. Not because you became passive, because you became selective. Selectivity is strength. Anyone can respond. Few can restrain themselves. Doing nothing in moments that don't deserve you is not indifference. It's self-respect. And self-respect is the foundation of every other form of power. That's why not everything deserves your energy. And that's why stillness isn't emptiness. It starts conservation. 5. Calm is not apathy, it is mastery. Most people misunderstand calm because they confuse it with indifference. They think if you don't react, you don't care. They think if you don't argue, you've given up. They think if you stay composed, you must be emotionally detached. That assumption comes from a culture addicted to expression. We taught that intensity equals sincerity, that loud emotion equals truth, that if something matters, it must show on your face and spill out of your mouth. That's not mastery. That's exposure. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It's the ability to feel without leaking. When you stayed calm, you didn't stop feeling anger, disappointment, or frustration. You felt all of it. You just didn't hand it over. That distinction is everything. Apathy feels empty. Calm feels full but contained. Apathetic people disengage because nothing matters. Calm people restrain themselves because everything matters. They understand the cost of impulse. Most emotional reactions are not honest. They reflexive. They come from the nervous system trying to discharge tension as fast as possible. Anger explodes to relieve pressure. Defensiveness rises to protect identity. Over-explaining tries to escape discomfort. None of that is intentional. Calm requires intention. It means you let the feeling pass through you without letting it decide for you. That's why calm feels threatening to people who rely on emotional chaos. They expect heat. They expect volatility. They expect you to show your hand. Instead, you stayed measured, and in that moment, the balance shifted. Because when you remain calm under pressure, you signal internal stability. You tell the room without words, I am not ruled by what just happened. That kind of control can be faked. Anyone can act calm when things are easy. Mastery shows when things are unfair, provocative, or emotionally charged. That sits when calm becomes visible. You didn't suppress your emotions. You regulated them. Suppression is force. Regulation is skill. Suppression eventually leaks. Regulation integrates. You allowed yourself to feel without becoming reactive. That sips emotional literacy, not avoidance. Most people never learn this. They confuse venting with healing. They confuse reaction with honesty. They confuse chaos with depth. But chaos doesn't mean depth. It means lack of containment. Containment is power. When you stayed calm, you didn't escalate the situation. You didn't absorb it either. You stood in the middle. That middle ground is rare. It requires awareness of your inner state and discipline over your outer behavior. That sips mastery. This is also why calm is often misread as coldness. People expect emotional transparency as reassurance. When they don't get it, they feel unsafe. Not because you sit doing something wrong, but because they relied on your reactions to orient themselves. Your calm removed their reference point. You didn't reassure them. You didn't escalate. You didn't perform. You held steady. That steadiness forced others to regulate themselves. And most people aren't used to that. They want you to match their intensity. They want you to mirror their emotion. They want you to carry half of their nervous system. Calm refuses that role. It says, I shall stay grounded. You handle your side. That boundary feels threatening to people who externalize regulation. But it sits healthy. This is why calm people often become anchors in crisis. Not because they don't feel fear, but because they don't broadcast it. They process internally and act deliberately. That sips mastery in real time. Calm also preserves dignity. When emotions spike, people say things they can't take back. They reveal insecurities they didn't intend to share. They make decisions that don't align with who they want to be. Calm protects you from that. It keeps your actions aligned with your values, not your impulses. That alignment builds self-trust, and self-trust is quiet confidence. You know you won't betray yourself under pressure. That knowledge changes how you move in the world. You stop fearing confrontation. You stop fearing provocation. You stop fearing misunderstanding because you trust your restraint. Calm is not passive. It is active self-command. It is choosing not to discharge emotion blindly. It is choosing timing over impulse. It is choosing outcome over relief. That choice is what most people never learn to make. You did, and that sits why calm is apathy. It sets mastery. 6. When you don't react, power shifts. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Most people think power looks like dominance, volume, or control over others. That sips surface-level power. Real power is control over yourself in moments designed to make you lose it. Every provocation is an invitation to give power away. Not because the other person is stronger, but because they are asking you to move on command. When you don't react, that command fails, and something subtle happens in the dynamic. The person who expected influence feels it slip. Power shifts not because you take it, but because you stop supplying it. This is the part people struggle to grasp. Power in social dynamics is often borrowed, not owned. It exists because someone keeps responding. Arguments need two participants. Drama needs attention. Manipulation needs feedback. Remove your response, and the structure collapses. When you stayed still, you didn't overpower anyone. You made their leverage irrelevant. That's why silence feels unsettling to those who expected compliance. They were prepared for resistance. They were prepared for emotion. They were prepared for negotiation. They were not prepared for non-participation. Non-participation removes hierarchy. You stir no longer above or below. You steer outside. And outside is where power actually lives. Because when you're outside the emotional exchange, you can see it clearly. You notice who is pushing. You notice who is escalating. You notice who needs a reaction to feel important. That awareness changes the balance immediately. The one who sees more controls more. This is why people often escalate when they sense power slipping. They raise their voice. They increase pressure. They manufacture urgency. Urgency is a power grab. It's an attempt to force you back into reaction mode. When you didn't take the bait, the escalation exposed their dependence on your response. They needed you to move so they could feel in control. Your stillness denied them that. Power also shifts internally. When you don't react, you experience a new kind of authority. You realize you're not obligated to answer every call. You're still not required to resolve every tension. You're not responsible for other people's emotional comfort. That realization is liberating. It breaks the unconscious contract many people live by. If someone is upset, I must respond. That contract was never fair. When you stepped out of it, you reclaimed your autonomy. Autonomy is the foundation of power. Without it, everything else is borrowed. This is also where respect begins to change. People may not like your silence. They may call it cold. They may interpret it as distance. But they adjust. Because humans adapt to boundaries faster than they admit. When you don't react, you teach others how to treat you without a lecture. Your behavior sets the terms. That sits more effective than any explanation. The power shift also exposes something uncomfortable. Some people only feel powerful when you are reactive. They don't want equality. They want influence. When you remove your reactions, those relationships feel hollow. The imbalance becomes obvious. That sips not your loss. That sips clarity. Power shifts also happen in your mind. You stop replaying conversations. You stop rehearsing responses. You stop living in imaginary arguments. Mental space opens. That space becomes focus. Focus becomes direction. Direction becomes momentum. You start moving forward instead of circling conflict. That forward movement is power in action. The strongest people are not those who win every exchange. They're the ones who choose which exchanges matter. When you didn't react, you chose yourself. You chose long-term stability over short-term relief. You chose dignity over dominance. You chose clarity over chaos. That choice changes how people see you. Not immediately, not loudly, but permanently. Because once someone realizes they can't push you into reaction, they treat you differently. They think before speaking. They measure their tone. They test less. Not out of fear, out of recalibration. Power has shifted, not because you fought, but because you stopped being movable. That's the kind of power no one can take from you. And once you feel it, you never go back. 7. Stillness is the final level. Most people think growth is about adding more confidence, more control, more skill, more expression. They set wrong. At the highest level, growth is subtraction. You remove the need to react. You remove the urge to explain. You remove the compulsion to prove, defend, or perform. What remains is stillness. And stillness isn't set empty. It sits precise. By the time you reach this level, you've already tried everything else. You, Stev, argued. You, Stev, explained. You, Stev, reacted. You, Stev, chased understanding. None of it gave you peace. So you stopped. Not because you gave up, but because you understood. Stillness is what's left when you no longer need external confirmation. At lower levels of awareness, people need reaction to feel real. They need validation to feel secure. They need movement to feel in control. At the final level, none of that is necessary. You trust yourself enough to be quiet. That trust changes everything. Stillness means you're no longer trying to win the moment. You start choosing alignment over applause. You don't need to correct every false narrative. You don't need to defend your intentions. You don't need to prove your worth. Because you already know who you are. That knowing removes urgency. Urgency is a sign of inner doubt. Stillness is a sign of inner certainty. This is why stillness feels heavy to others. They sense you sit not scrambling. They feel you sit not chasing. They notice you sit not reacting on command. And that unsettles people who live on momentum. Most of the world runs on noise, opinions, arguments, performances. Stillness steps outside that current. It doesn't oppose it. It doesn't fight it. It simply doesn't enter. That's why stillness is the final level. There sits nothing left to prove. This doesn't mean you become passive or invisible. It means your actions become intentional. You speak when it adds value. You move when it creates change. You engage when it aligns with your principles. Everything else is ignored. That selectivity looks like detachment to those who are still reactive. But it sits actually clarity. You've learned something most people never do. Not every stimulus deserves a response. Not every emotion deserves expression. Not every battle deserves engagement. Stillness is discernment in its purest form. It's the ability to hold space without filling it, to observe without intervening, to remain centered while chaos moves around you. That ability doesn't come from suppression. It comes from integration. You've integrated your emotions instead of acting them out. You've integrated your ego instead of feeding it. You've integrated your identity instead of defending it. That integration is maturity. And maturity is quiet. At this level, you stop needing others to understand you. You stop needing closure. You stop needing the last word. Because you understand something deeper. Peace doesn't come from being right. It comes from being whole. Stillness protects that wholeness. It keeps your inner state independent of external noise. It keeps your direction clear. It keeps your energy intact. That's why stillness feels like an ending. It is. It's the end of reactivity, the end of emotional bargaining, the end of living at the mercy of other people's behavior. What begins after that is freedom. Not dramatic freedom, not loud freedom, quiet freedom, the kind where nothing needs to happen for you to be okay. That's the final level, and once you reach it, there's no reason to go back, because you passed the exam. And the strongest move you ever made was doing nothing. 8. You became unavailable without disappearing. Most people think power comes from presence. Being seen, being heard, being involved. That sits true at lower levels. At higher levels, power comes from availability, or more precisely from the control of it. When you stopped reacting, something changed that most people couldn't name. You were still there, but you were no longer reachable in the same way. You didn't disappear. You didn't announce distance. You didn't make a statement. You simply became unavailable to nonsense. That shift is subtle, and that's why it's powerful. Disappearing is dramatic. It invites pursuit. It invites speculation. It invites stories. Becoming unavailable without disappearing removes all of that. There sits nothing to chase. Nothing to confront. Nothing to interpret. Just absence of access. This is where most people fail. They confuse boundaries with declarations. They announce changes. They explain why they set or pulling back. They justify distance. That explanation reopens the door. True unavailability doesn't explain itself. It's behavioral. You stopped answering immediately. You stopped engaging emotionally. You stopped showing up where you were drained. Not out of spite, out of alignment. And alignment doesn't negotiate. This is deeply unsettling to people who relied on your accessibility. They were used to you being responsive, predictable, emotionally available on demand. Your stillness broke that expectation. And when expectations break, entitlement is exposed. Some people reacted with confusion, some with irritation, some with guilt tactics, some with sudden affection. None of that was about reconnecting with you. It was about regaining access. That sits the uncomfortable truth. Availability feels like love to people who benefit from it. But love survives boundaries. Entitlement doesn't. When you became unavailable without disappearing, you forced a reckoning. People had to relate to you without control, without emotional leverage, without predictability. Some couldn't. Those relationships faded quietly. That wasn't loss. That was filtration. You also learned something important about yourself. You realized how much of your identity was tied to responsiveness, to being needed, to being relied on. Stepping back felt strange at first. You wondered if you were being cold, if you were changing too much, if you were becoming someone else. You weren't. You were becoming less accessible to what never deserved you. That distinction matters. Unavailability doesn't mean isolation. It means selectivity. You still show up fully where it sits mutual. You still speak clearly where it sits constructive. You still engage where there sits respect. Everywhere else you conserve. That conservation creates presence. When you do speak now, it carries weight. When you do engage, it sits intentional. When you do show emotion, it sits chosen. People feel that difference. You're no longer background noise in your own life. This is also why some people interpret your change as distance or arrogance. They sit not reacting to who you are. They stir reacting to what they lost. Access. Your stillness didn't make you distant. It made you unavailable to misuse. And misuse often hides behind familiarity. By staying present but not reactive, you removed the illusion of obligation. You didn't owe explanations. You didn't owe energy. You didn't owe emotional labor. That realization is liberating. You stop living as an open system. You stop absorbing everything. You stop being shaped by every interaction. You become self-contained. Not closed, contained. Contained people are grounded. They don't leak emotion. They don't chase validation. They don't rush to respond. They choose. And choice is the final form of freedom. You didn't disappear to be noticed. You didn't withdraw to punish. You didn't go silent to manipulate. You simply stopped offering access where it wasn't honored. That sits maturity. That sits restraint. That's why your stillness didn't push the right people away. It revealed them. And that's why becoming unavailable without disappearing is one of the most powerful moves you'll ever make. Because you didn't leave the world. You just stopped letting it pull you apart. 9. You stopped bleeding in public. Most people don't realize how much of their pain they broadcast. Not intentionally, not dramatically, but through reactions. Every emotional response is a signal. Every outburst, explanation, or visible frustration tells the world where you're wounded. And there are always people watching. Some out of concern, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet satisfaction. When you stopped reacting, you stopped bleeding in public. That doesn't mean the pain vanished. It means you stop turning it into an invitation. Pain expressed without containment becomes exposure. Exposure invites interference. People feel entitled to comment on wounds they can see. They feel licensed to advise, judge, or exploit what's visible. Stillness closed that door. You learned that not everyone deserves to witness your inner state. Not everyone has the maturity to hold it. Not everyone has good intentions. When you reacted before, you thought you were being honest. You thought you were being real. But real without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. You were giving away information you couldn't take back. Your tone revealed exhaustion. Your defensiveness revealed insecurity. Your anger revealed what mattered most. None of that helped you heal. It only taught others how to approach you. When you went quiet, the narrative changed. People no longer knew what to do with your pain. They couldn't see it. They couldn't step measure it. They couldn't respond to it. And that forced them into one of two positions: respect or distance. Those who respected you gave you space without pressure. They didn't demand updates. They didn't push for explanations. They trusted your process. Those who couldn't respect you drifted or reacted. Both outcomes were clean. Stillness didn't numb you. It protected you. You realized something important. Healing doesn't require broadcasting. Processing doesn't require an audience. Growth doesn't need commentary. Most wounds heal best away from noise. By staying still, you created a private space for recovery. No interruptions, no opinions, no emotional trespassing. You kept your pain where it belonged. Inside, handled, integrated. This is where people get confused. They think silence means repression. They think quiet means denial. It doesn't. Repression hides pain from yourself. Stillness hides it from others while you face it fully. That's its strength. You stopped letting moments of hurt define your public identity. You didn't let a bad day become a reputation. You didn't let a conflict become your personality. You didn't let vulnerability become currency. That choice gave you control over your narrative. And control over narrative is power. People stopped predicting your reactions. They stopped assuming your emotional state. They stopped stepping into your space uninvited. Because there was nothing visible to grab. This also changed how you saw yourself. When you stopped bleeding publicly, you stopped reinforcing the wound. Every time pain is expressed impulsively, it's relived. Every time you retell it, you strengthen its hold. Stillness breaks that loop. You feel it once, deeply, then let it pass. Not suppressed, not dramatized. Integrated. That integration is healing. You became quieter, not colder. You became more contained, not distant. And containment is what allows wounds to close. The world doesn't need access to your healing process. It only needs to see the result. When you emerge steadier, calmer, and less reactive, people notice. They don't know what changed. They just feel the difference. And that difference commands respect without explanation. You stopped bleeding in public, and in doing so, you reclaimed your privacy. Not secrecy, privacy. The right to heal without spectators. The right to grow without commentary. The right to feel without exposure. That right changes everything. Because when pain no longer leaks out, it stops controlling the space around you. You stir no longer defined by what hurt you. You stir defined by how you hold yourself. And stillness taught you how to hold yourself with dignity. That's why silence wasn't emptiness. It was containment. And containment is strength. 10. You won without being seen winning. Most people are conditioned to think victory needs witnesses. They think if no one sees it, it doesn't count. If there's no acknowledgement, no apology, no visible shift, then nothing really changed. That belief keeps people trapped. Because the deepest wins never announce themselves. When you stopped reacting, You didn't get applause. You didn't get validation. You didn't get a moment where everyone suddenly understood. What you got was something quieter and far more permanent. You got freedom. You won the moment you no longer needed the outcome to look a certain way. That sips the part most people miss. They want the other person to admit fault. They want closure spoken out loud. They want recognition for their restraint. That need keeps the tie alive. Stillness cuts it. When you did nothing, the conflict didn't end theatrically. It ended structurally. The dynamic no longer had access to you. No reaction meant no continuation. No engagement meant no new chapter. No defense meant no argument to resolve. The situation starved and collapsed. That sets a win without witnesses. And it sits the hardest kind for the ego to accept. Because the ego wants credit. It wants to be seen as right. It wants proof that restraint mattered. It wants confirmation that silence wasn't weakness. But growth doesn't cater to ego. Growth removes the need for confirmation. When you stayed still, you didn't win the argument. You outgrew it. That sips a different level of victory. You didn't dominate the other person. You disengaged from the need to. That sips why nothing dramatic happened afterward. No explosion. No final conversation. No cinematic ending. Just distance. Just quiet. Just a subtle reordering of your inner world. And that sips how you know it was real. Surface wins are loud. They leave residue. They invite rematches. This one didn't stess. You walked away internally long before anything changed externally. And once the inner detachment happens, the outer situation becomes irrelevant. That sips the moment power becomes irreversible. Because no one can pull you back into a game you're no longer playing. This is also why some people never acknowledge what happened. They don't say sorry. They don't admit fault. They don't even mention the shift. Not because they didn't notice, because acknowledging it would mean admitting they lost access. Silence protects their pride. Your stillness protected your peace. That trade was worth it. You learned something critical here. Winning isn't about changing others. It's about no longer being changed by them. When you can sit in the same room, the same memory or the same name, and feel nothing pull at you, you've already won. No announcement needed. The strongest victories don't rewrite the past. They make it powerless. You didn't need justice. You didn't need validation. You didn't need the final word. You needed autonomy. And stillness gave it to you. This is why people who've truly grown don't talk much about what they survived. They said not hiding it. They said done living in it. The chapter closed without a ceremony. That sits maturity. You won without being seen winning. And that's why the win lasted. Because it wasn't set for show. It was for freedom. And freedom never needs witnesses. You didn't go quiet because you were afraid. You went quiet because you understood. You saw that reaction was a tax you no longer needed to pay. That explanation was a trap disguised as clarity. That noise kept you tied to things beneath you. So you chose stillness. Not to punish, not to prove, not to disappear, but to protect what mattered. And in that stillness, something fundamental shifted. You stopped bleeding. You stopped bargaining. You stopped handing your power to moments that didn't deserve it. The world kept moving. People kept talking. Nothing dramatic happened. And that's how you know it worked. Because the strongest changes are invisible. They happen inside, where no one can interfere. You didn't just lose your voice. You found your center. You didn't walk away. You stood still and let everything else pass. That was the final exam, and the strongest move you ever made was doing nothing